Hello, my dear friends. I want to present you with the second course on Jean Calvin. It will be a story of his life after he returned to Geneva. So let me share the screen. Okay, here it is. It is the second ministry in Geneva from 1542 until his death in 1564. After he and Farel were kicked out of Geneva, Geneva actually was in turmoil and was on the verge of war with Bern. So they would try to they got rid of the Catholic Church. The Cardinal Sadolet had written a letter of encouraging Geneva to return. Geneva asked John Calvin, who was residing in Strasbourg, to write a letter in defense, which he did, which became a very famous not only defense of Bern or of Geneva, but of the entire Reformation. And nonetheless, Geneva was in a chaos at the time. The mayors didn't do a good job, and they made unfavorable negotiations with Bern, which ultimately cost even their life, and so they were not anymore alive. In the end, Geneva Council and mayors sent Calvin an official plea addressing him affectionately as dear brother and inquiring whether he might consider returning. On top of that, the councils of Bern, Zurich, and Basel supported this initiative, saying the deportation was entirely wrong, had been entirely wrong. Nonetheless, even though there was such a effort made, Calvin's initial reaction was unmistakably negative. He said, "There are wounds that bleed upon being touched." And even earlier, he had told Guillaume Farel that he would rather face 100 deaths than return to Geneva. The reason he listened to his older friend was, I think because he was older, and he already had listened to him when he passed by Geneva on his way to Strasbourg, and Guillaume convinced him to stay in Geneva. So he listened a second time to Farel, and in the end, Farel, who is a great preacher man and a great man of God, could convince Calvin to consider to return. However, upon his return, he requested to establish church discipline as it had been once upon a time in the old church. And exactly because of this, the council had asked him to return. So, in contrast to earlier attempts, the more favorable circumstances this time enabled Calvin's eventual success. However, this too came at a cost, marked by personal tragedies that others at the center had already come to know all too well. So, but now, Calvin stood unchallenged as Geneva's spiritual leader. While the council retained its supervisory role, the new composition of its membership ensured favorable conditions for Calvin. So there was, to give you an understanding, the government was this council. There was the Grand Council, which was the highest legislative body. It was comprised of about 200 members, and they were responsible for making laws and political decisions. This included, for instance, also excommunication. There's and a small council. This was an executive governing body, also called the City Council. It consisted of around 25 to 30 members, and it functioned as the city's government cabinet managing day-to-day affairs and enforcing policies. This was made up by the leadership of the town, so-called bourgeoisie. The council's efforts in material matters demonstrated his serious commitment. Calvin received a house with a garden, an annual salary, and provisions allowing him to host guests. Accompanied by his brother, Calvin's brother, Idelette, his wife, arrived in Geneva soon after. I make a jump in time here. By 1555, the authority to excommunicate was shifted from the council to the consistory. That was a body set up by Calvin to maintain church discipline. Also, the reason he got more influence was that the number of French refugees filled the city. So in the end, so there were 12,000 people living, but because of the refugees, the number was rising on to 21,000 in the end. So the refusal to administer the sacrament without the city council's permission signaled a significant shift in authority. For the religious life that Calvin had in mind, there were three key elements that became the main focus in establishing religious order: doctrine, church governments, and the sacraments. In his reply to Cardinal Sadolet, the French cardinal, he already outlined this in this famous letter, which was a defense asked by Geneva, so that the Catholic Church could, could get their answers, upon returning to Geneva, which was clearly negative. So candidates for the priesthood had to demonstrate, in addition to theological qualifications, an impeccable moral character and receive approval from the city council. Every 3 months, they were called together for education, admonition, and support. The church ministry served 12,000 inhabitants who were distributed across 3 congregations. On Sundays, there were a total of 11 sermons at 4 a.m., 8 a.m., noon, and 8 p.m. The congregation could choose which church they would go, and Calvin was serious in making sure that also the priests were rotating, so that the congregation would not choose the sermon according to liking, but it was more for him that the catechism, the conveying of the contents of the Bible were more important than personal charisma. So sermons were also held on weekdays at 6 in the morning in all 3 congregations. The attendance at church services was mandatory. Arriving late, falling asleep during the service, or leaving early resulted in warnings or fines. On the other side, when somebody couldn't come and he was sick for already 3 days, there was a report requested, and a priest came to counsel, but also to even help physically. The Holy Supper was held 4 times a year. So the holy bread and holy wine. But before receiving the sacraments, reconciliation was urged to ensure worthy participation in the Lord's Supper. So reconciliation when you had, were at an argument with your neighbor or with your wife, or this all should have been cleared before receiving the sacrament. For the children, adequate catechism instruction was a prerequisite for receiving the Holy Communion. Strangers were required to demonstrate their knowledge of the catechism. Every Sunday was dedicated to remembering Christ's death and resurrection. Religious celebrations such as Christmas, also Easter and Pentecost, which were considered unbiblical, were not observed. So you can see the three churches in Geneva. This was Saint-Gervais, Saint-Pierre, and Magdalene. Yeah, Geneva began attracting Protestant refugees from all over Europe, including Great Britain. John Knox, the Reformer of Scotland, wrote that Geneva was the most perfect school of Christ that ever was on the earth since the days of the apostles. On the other hand, the at times coercive implementation of church law in Geneva, however, met with mixed reactions among the population. And of course, there were those who were more interested in getting rid of the Catholic Church because of their personal benefit than because of the Reformation. And they were called the Libertines. And those were known to live loose and were not really faithful. And they hated Calvin and the changes he made. So Geneva abolished taverns in 1546 and replaced them with cafes that had strict rules. There was no indecorous speech, nor bawdy song was to be permitted within the premises. Meals were not to be partaken unless grace had been solemnly said both before and after the meal. A Bible in the French tongue was to be kept on hand at all times, for consultation on the spiritual edification of those present. The irony was Calvin's fame increased outside, but the unpopularity continued inside. So there was regulations for private and public morality. This was you were jailed for fornication. On the other side, provisions was also made for medical care for the poor in their own homes. Begging was strictly forbidden. Accusations against respected families for hosting dance events, committing adultery, and impregnating the maid. Yeah. So this was a very serious act, and they thought they could get away with it, but they couldn't, they didn't. Yeah. On the other side, there were, because these families also were powerful, there were many onslaughts on him, and Calvin experienced trials besides being accused, but also personal ones. So as I mentioned earlier, he lost his wife and son. First his son, subsequently, because the health of his wife deteriorated, less than 9 years after they married, his wife died. And this was a very painful experience and situation that Calvin experienced and expressed. The members of the small council named him a Picardian villain, because the area where he comes from was the Picardy. It's still called that way today. His enemies named him Cain instead of Calvin, and the dogs were named Calvin. Privileged families were angered by the interference in their traditional privileges. Added to this was the fear of being overrun by foreigners. The influx of French refugees in particular caused the city's population to rise to over 21,000 inhabitants. Bolsek, this was a theologian, also a priest. He challenged him in this debate on double predestination. Yeah, so this double predestination means that as one's fate is already predetermined, so the one who God will save is already predetermined. The argument of the critics was on the other side, and also those who are damned, who are going for hell, they also have to be determined. Yeah, so this was called a double predestination. Yeah, so there was a serious discussion going on. This treatise against Calvin shaped the Catholic view of Calvin well into the 19th century. Yeah, the Catholic, how they view him. In this way, Bolsek had thoroughly taken his revenge on Calvin. In 1552, he was banished from Geneva. Calvin emphasized that those excluded from the Lord's Supper were not outcasts in terms of the predestination, but the exclusion was a disciplinary measure. The same applied to temporary banishment from the city. He also distinguished between personal insults and attacks on his theology. It was the latter that he opposed with particular vehemence. For Calvin, theology wasn't a detached academic exercise, nor merely a matter of personal taste. It was the truth, God revealed in Scripture, and therefore objectively sacred, not subject to human pride or preference. So when he reacted fiercely to attack on his theology, he believed he was defending God's honor, not his own. In the modern mind, also in my personal mind, I must say that it is very difficult to separate the personal ego from divine truths, even though, of course, it is hard to entirely disentangle them. In today's mind, I think some of us would see his theology as quite personal. And there was one situation that I think in my personal view is, ongoing attacks by others compelled Calvin to become a prolific and eloquent defender of the doctrine of predestination. Yeah, he knew it was difficult to accept, yet he defended it nonetheless. So he could be harsh with critics. Calvin did not take challenges to his authority or theology lightly. Yeah, so his reactions, especially in writing, could be cutting or even merciless, especially in polemical contexts. Yeah. So he wasn't necessarily a person you would like to go into a fight. And there is this situation with Michael Servetus that came up. He was a gifted Spanish physician and would-be theologian and notorious heretic. Already in France, Calvin had an appointment with him. He was already on the run. Servetus was already outlawed in France, because he wrote a book on the errors of the Trinity and the restitution of Christianity, in which he attacked Orthodox Christian doctrine and practice. So again, this was an attack on the Council of Nicaea, and both the Reformed and the Catholic Church were sharing this ground, and they would not compromise there. It was, for them, it was the foundation of Christianity, and who went against this actually went against everything they believed in and everything they were living with. So it was not just an attack on religion or your personal private belief, but it was an attack on society, on the king, on everything. So therefore, he was outlawed already in France. He was arrested by the Spanish Inquisition, but he could escape. He had a friend in the king's chamber somewhere, and made his way to Paris and he were under concealed identity and became a physician even to the archbishop. However, unknown reasons, he came to France. He had a correspondence with Calvin. Calvin didn't like him, actually. But anyway, for some unknown reasons, he made his way to Geneva. He was recognized and arrested while sitting in church. Calvin was asked to be the advisor. So he was not he didn't accuse, he was already accused. His fate was already settled. Yeah. The question only was for the council, would Geneva stand on the basis of the Council of Nicaea? Would it stand on the foundations of Christianity or not? And it is that in a way they took delight in burning him to death in 1553 to show the world the orthodoxy of Geneva. Yeah. So later it was said that Calvin was the man behind this, but actually already when he was caught in Geneva, his fate was already decided. Yeah. So this was the medieval frame of mind, or that was how life was. Like nowadays, some nations have death penalty on certain crimes. Similarly, it was like that. Yeah. So Calvin's status continued to improve. He defeated the libertines, and refugees continued to pour into the city, and Geneva became a truly international city, closely observed by all. Calvin then was given the Genevan citizenship. Then the religion under Calvin became not only a change of self, but a transformation of public life and manners. So when you were living in Geneva, you had to be part of this, become part of the lifestyle of Geneva as well. The Geneva Academy started in 1559. It was the greatest center of instruction in the Reformed Communion. It sent out hundreds of missionaries to France, the Netherlands, Scotland, the German lands, and Italy. It was a dynamic engine of Reformed growth for the next 100 years. Calvin obtained recognition as the only international reformer. This is a monument you can find in Geneva. And on the far left is Guillaume Farel, his good friend and advisor, who brought him 2 times to Geneva. One time kept him in Geneva, one time brought him to Geneva. Beza was his successor, and John Knox, he was his admirer, famous Scottish reformer. Is the Calvin statue, and he insisted on an unmarked grave. Yeah, thank you for listening. I will stop sharing here. So thank you very much for your participation in these lectures. At the end of this, I will show you also a short movie of 4 minutes about Calvin. Those who participate live in this presentation on Thursday will also see this movie. Otherwise, give me a few 2 minutes for my closing words. So this lecture was intended to be my last, and I believe that ending with Calvin, a true heavyweight in the history of religion, will make for a worthy conclusion. What I noticed during my studies at our theological seminary was that I discovered many common elements among the various, sometimes strongly contradictory ideas of the past 2000 years. I have emerged from this experience more convinced than ever as a member of the unification movement. I am fascinated by Calvin's ability to create a framework for action within the Reformation, a real treat for lovers of religion, especially those for whom veneration plays a role. I found the topic of education of priests both interesting and instructive. In my church, we actually have clear guidelines from our founder on how a sermon should be prepared and presented. If these were enforced, it would be a true challenge for the preacher, but at the same time, a feast for an audience moved at heart. These guidelines have been emphasized at times, but never established as a consistent system. Perhaps an employment-based system would help here, one that is required to adhere to clear directives. Voluntariness in all areas can also lead to permissiveness and even negligence. As a final thought, I would like to express a wish that concerns us all, namely to live a life we can look back on without shame. There should be not a single moment of defeat that has not been transformed into a victory in our lives. This applies especially to our moral conscience. In the end, it is the conscience that tells us whether everything is truly in order within us. In this spirit, thank you very much, and may you find great joy in experiencing the Holy Spirit who fills us wherever we allow God into our lives.